main practices in human history, casting a long shadow over the past that continues to influence modern societies. From the ancient empires to the transatlantic slave trade and its lasting impact on race relations and economic inequality, slavery's legacy is a reminder of humanity's capacity for both cruelty and resilience. This article delves into the deep roots of slavery, its brutal operations, and the lasting scars it left across the world. Slavery's roots stretch back thousands of years, originating in the early agricultural and tribal societies that formed the foundations of civilization. While the concept of forced labor existed in various forms across many cultures, it is essential to understand that slavery was not always based on race. The earliest forms of slavery were typically a result of war, debt, or crime. As early human societies grew in complexity and population, they required vast amounts of labor for agricultural production, infrastructure, and warfare. Thus, slavery became integral to the economic, social, and political fabric of early empires. Some of the earliest records of slavery come from Mesopotamia, where slaves were typically prisoners of war, criminals, or individuals sold into servitude due to unpaid debts. The Code of Hammurabi, one of the oldest legal documents, provided regulations for slavery, defining slaves as property, but granting them certain rights, such as owning possessions and eventually earning their freedom. While Egyptian society also utilized slavery, especially for large-scale construction projects like the pyramids, it was more fluid compared to later systems. Many slaves were prisoners of war or foreigners who could, in some cases, integrate into Egyptian society over time. Slaves in Egypt worked in various sectors, including agriculture, domestic service, and royal projects, but they were not treated as brutally as in later systems. In the classical civilizations of Greece and Rome, slavery was an established institution and a crucial component of economic success and political stability. Ancient Greece relied heavily on slavery for both public and private enterprises. In Athens, for example, as many as one-third of the population were slaves. They worked in homes, fields, mines, and even as skilled artisans. Greek slaves could sometimes earn or buy their freedom, and some could rise to positions of relative influence, though they were still considered property with limited legal rights. The Roman Empire took slavery to an industrial scale. Slaves in Rome came from various sources: prisoners of war from Rome's constant military campaigns, pirates, and trade markets. They worked on vast latifundia, large agricultural estates, in households or in gladiatorial arenas for public entertainment. Slavery was essential for Rome's economy, and some estimates suggest that over one-third of the population of Rome consisted of slaves at certain points in the empire's history. Though some slaves could earn manumission, the brutal conditions, especially for those in mines or rural plantations, made survival difficult. The most infamous form of slavery in global history is the transatlantic slave trade, a system of human exploitation that forcibly transported millions of Africans to the Americas between the 16th and 19th centuries. This practice not only dehumanized individuals on an unimaginable scale, but also established racial hierarchies and ideologies that continue to affect societies today. The transatlantic slave trade began in the early 1500s, coinciding with European exploration and colonization of the Americas. European powers such as Spain, Portugal, England, France, and the Netherlands established colonies in the New World, where they developed labor-intensive agricultural industries like sugar, tobacco, and cotton. These industries required large workforces that could not be sustained through indigenous populations who were decimated by disease and conflict. Contrary to the myth that Europeans captured Africans single-handedly, African leaders and traders were deeply involved in the slave trade. Powerful African kingdoms, such as Dahomey and the Ashanti Empire, participated by capturing people from rival tribes and selling them to European traders. In exchange, these kingdoms received goods such as firearms, textiles, and alcohol, which increased their power and influence. The journey from Africa to the Americas, known as the Middle Passage, was one of the most horrific aspects of the slave trade. Enslaved Africans were packed tightly into ships, often in chains, with barely enough room to sit or stand. The overcrowded conditions, along with malnutrition, disease, and abuse, caused a high mortality rate. It's estimated that anywhere from 15% to 20% of enslaved Africans died during the voyage. Those who survived faced a lifetime of enslavement and brutal exploitation. Upon arriving in the New World, enslaved Africans were sold in markets and forced to work on plantations that produced cash crops for European markets. The economies of the Caribbean, Brazil, and the southern United States depended almost entirely on slave labor. The Caribbean was one of the most notorious regions for the brutal treatment of slaves. Sugar plantations in Jamaica, Haiti, and Barbados were known for their harsh conditions, with enslaved workers enduring long hours under the scorching sun, physical abuse, and malnutrition. The mortality rate was so high that plantation owners constantly sought new shipments of slaves from Africa to replenish the workforce. Brazil was the largest importer of enslaved Africans, receiving an estimated 5 million people, nearly half of all the Africans trafficked across the Atlantic. Brazil's sugar and coffee plantations were similarly harsh environments, and even after the abolition of slavery, racial inequality and social segregation persisted. In the southern United States, slavery became the foundation of the economy, particularly in the production of cotton and tobacco. Enslaved Africans and their descendants were forced to work in fields under strict control, facing brutal punishments for disobedience. Slave codes legally defined enslaved people as property, stripping them of all rights and reducing them to commodities to be bought, sold, and inherited. Despite the overwhelming violence and oppression, enslaved Africans did not accept their fate passively. Acts of resistance ranged from subtle forms like work, slowdowns, and sabotage to open rebellion. Slavery fostered a legacy of resistance, sparking revolts that eventually contributed to the abolition movements. In the Caribbean and South America, groups of runaway slaves, known as Maroons, established independent communities in remote areas, such as the mountains or jungles. These communities often engaged in guerrilla warfare against European colonial powers and successfully maintained their independence for years, particularly in places like Jamaica and Suriname. The most successful slave rebellion occurred in Haiti, where enslaved Africans led by Toussaint Louverture overthrew French colonial rule. The Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, not only resulted in the creation of the first independent Black Republic, but also sent shockwaves throughout the colonial world, inspiring other enslaved populations to rise up against their oppressors. In the U.S., slave uprisings, though often brutally suppressed, were relatively common. One of the most famous revolts was led by Nat Turner in 1831, where enslaved people rose up against their masters in Virginia, killing over 50 white individuals before the rebellion was crushed. While these rebellions were not always successful, they served as important symbols of resistance and human dignity. The abolition of slavery did not occur overnight. It was the result of decades of activism, political pressure, and shifting economic conditions. By the 19th century, a growing movement emerged in Europe and the Americas to end slavery, influenced by humanitarian, religious, and economic factors. By the late 18th century, abolitionist movements began to take shape in Europe and the United States. Activists, religious leaders, and former slaves used pamphlets, books, speeches, and political campaigns to expose the horrors of slavery and demand its abolition. Religious groups, especially the Quakers, were among the earliest and most vocal opponents of slavery. They argued that the practice violated Christian principles of human dignity and equality. In Britain, evangelical Christian figures like William Wilberforce led the campaign to end the slave trade, using moral arguments to sway public opinion and lawmakers. In the U.S., freed slaves such as Frederick Douglass became prominent voices in the abolitionist movement. Douglass, who had escaped slavery, became an influential writer, speaker, and activist, using his own experience to highlight the cruelty of slavery. His autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, became one of the most important works in the abolitionist canon. Over time, abolitionist efforts began to bear fruit in the form of legal reforms and emancipation decrees. Britain was one of the first countries to take significant steps toward ending slavery. The Slave Trade Act of 1807 made it illegal to engage in the slave trade within the British Empire. While this act did not immediately end slavery itself, it marked a critical step in the broader abolitionist cause. In 1833, the Slavery Abolition Act was passed, effectively freeing nearly 800,000 enslaved people throughout the British colonies. In the U.S., the road to abolition was longer and bloodier. The American Civil War, 1861 to 1865, was fought largely over the issue of slavery, pitting the pro-slavery Confederate South against the anti-slavery Union North. In 1863, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring all slaves in Confederate-held territory to be free. However, it was not until the end of the war and the passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865 that slavery was officially abolished throughout the country. Slavery persisted in parts of Latin America longer than in the United States. Cuba and Brazil, in particular, were among the last countries in the Americas to abolish slavery. Brazil officially ended slavery in 1888 with the Golden Law, which freed all remaining enslaved people without compensation to slaveholders. While slavery was abolished legally, its impact did not disappear with the stroke of a pen. The legacy of slavery has deeply shaped the modern world, especially in terms of race relations, economic disparities, and cultural development. One of the most enduring legacies of slavery is institutional racism. The ideology of white supremacy, developed to justify the enslavement of black Africans, continued to influence social structures even after emancipation. In the U.S., the end of slavery was followed by the institution of Jim Crow laws, a series of legal and social measures that enforced racial segregation and disenfranchised black Americans. These laws perpetuated economic inequality, restricted voting rights, and maintained a system of racial hierarchy that persisted well into the 20th century. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s was necessary to dismantle these laws, but systemic racism remains a major issue today. In Africa, the loss of millions of people to the slave trade destabilized societies and stunted economic growth. After the abolition of slavery, European powers turned to colonization, further exploiting African resources and people. In the Caribbean, post-slavery societies were left with economic dependency on monoculture industries and a rigid social hierarchy based on race. The wealth generated by slavery enriched European nations and the American elite, creating economic inequalities that persist to this day. In the U.S., the economic benefits of slavery were felt primarily by white landowners and business elites, many of whom passed their wealth down through generations. Meanwhile, formerly enslaved people and their descendants were denied land, education, and opportunities to build wealth, creating a lasting racial wealth gap. The riches accumulated from the exploitation of enslaved Africans allowed Europe and the United States to industrialize rapidly, while the regions that supplied the labor, West Africa, the Caribbean, and parts of Latin America, remained underdeveloped. This unequal distribution of wealth and power still affects global economic relations today. Despite the horrors of slavery, the African diaspora has had an immeasurable impact on global culture, particularly in the Americas. African traditions, beliefs, and customs blended with those of indigenous and European cultures to create rich, dynamic cultural expressions. The musical traditions brought over by enslaved Africans laid the foundation for many modern genres, including jazz, blues, gospel, reggae, samba, and hip-hop. African rhythms, spirituals, and storytelling have influenced some of the most iconic cultural movements of the 20th and 21st centuries. In the Caribbean and Latin America, African languages mixed with European languages, creating creoles and pidgins that are still spoken today. Additionally, many African spiritual traditions, such as Vodou in Haiti and Santeria in Cuba, survived the Middle Passage and have blended with Catholicism and indigenous practices, creating unique religious cultures. The history of slavery is a testament to both the cruelty humans can inflict and the strength of the human spirit in the face of oppression. From the ancient empires to the transatlantic slave trade, slavery left an indelible mark on world history. While the legal institution of slavery has been abolished, its legacy, seen in systemic racism, economic inequality, and cultural contributions, remains with us today. Understanding this dark chapter is crucial for addressing the enduring injustices and working toward a more equitable future. Slavery may have ended, but its shadow continues to loom over societies, reminding us of the need for ongoing dialogue, healing, and systemic change. Only by confronting the past can we hope to build a future free from the inequalities and prejudices that this horrific institution has left behind.